Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gerard Robinson. I am the Vice President for Education at the Advanced Studies and Culture Foundation located in beautiful Charlottesville, Virginia. We are a support organization to the Institute for Advanced Studies, which is a research in culture, which is a research center here at the University of Virginia. And what we've done is we've created a center that focuses on education, leadership, and culture. And as you know, every month we take time, an hour and 15 minutes, to have a conversation with different people about topics focused on education. The one that we had in September focused on education and the good. The event we had in October focused on race and ethics and culture. The event we had last month focused on presidential elections and what it would mean to K-20 education moving forward. And so I'm excited today because we have an opportunity to talk about K-20 education in review. As many of us know, 2020 as related to education is like any other in recent memory. With COVID-19, it had a tremendous impact on our schools, a number of school closures, a number of people within the education sector, both public and private, who lost employment, the number of vendors, the number of people who provide bus services to our children, the number of people who provide professional support to our educators had their lives impacted. We also know a number of people, in fact, lost their lives, loved ones, friends, and others. And so my condolences will go out to everyone in the education sector who's lost someone or who has someone who's sick or someone who's actually recovering right now, because this has had a tremendous impact upon families. And so what we do here at the center is to ask questions that we think are important to what we have to do. And while I say K-20 education, naturally, we will also talk about pre-K as well. When we think about 2020, because we're in an election cycle and transitioning into that both literally and politically, it looks really interesting in terms of where we're going to go. But we know before we know where we want to go, we have to step back and see where we've been. And so I've assembled some people with me, and I'm going to just say a few words about each person, and then we will start the conversation. For those of you who have questions, when we get to that part of the event, you can raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you and we'll go from there. And so I'd like to introduce Jeanne DelColle, who is the Executive Director for the Center for Future Educators at the College of New Jersey. I used to actually live in Jersey City and know her college quite well. She brings to this position years of experience, both in the classroom, but also understanding the administrative aspects of public education, and glad that she's going to join us. We've got Michael Horn, who is the co-founder and distinguished fellow at the Clay Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation. Michael is not only an entrepreneur, he's also an author of a really good book on higher education and what it will look like. He's got his fingers in both higher ed, K-12, but also in technology. And what will that mean as we think about teaching and learning? So glad to have him here. We have Jennifer Betrani, who is the president of Respectability. It is a national nonprofit organization that works with lawmakers, people in Hollywood, educators, people also in the criminal justice system, but people across the board who have some contact with the 55+ million people who have a disability, and at least 6 million of those who are in our public school system. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so I think it's only fitting that we have a conversation with a leading expert and leader of a national nonprofit who can talk to us about what this means for our community. So Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. We're also joined by Michael Schutlaufen, who is the Executive Director of the Council for American Private Education. It is a nonprofit organization located in Washington, D.C., and they work with a diverse set of religious institutions that have private schools. Private schools, like public schools, have been impacted by COVID-19 as well, and his school sector has done a number of things to provide teaching and learning in that sector, and it's important to learn some lessons and what they're doing there. So Michael, thank you for joining us. And our last person, although not least, is Thomas Stewart. He is the Vice Chancellor for Social Justice, Diversity and Inclusion at National University, which is a network of 4 higher education institutions educating more than 45,000 students in the United States and abroad, with more than 250,000 students who are part of its worldwide alumni network. He is the president of two colleges, and I happen to serve on the board of trustees of one of those colleges. And he's also a commissioner of WASC. And so he can talk to us about being a college administrator and what that looks like, but also what does it mean for accreditation, both K-12 and higher ed. So welcome to our conversation, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
You know, what I want to do, and like I do with all events, is just to ask each one of you to tell me about yourself and your journey to how you became Michael and Michael, how you became Jeanne, how you became Jennifer, and how you became Tom. And so, Jeanne, let's start off with you and tell us who's Jeanne and how did you arrive at this point in life?
Jeanne DelColle, but most of my students know me as Miss D, so I have an alter ego, right? Don't most teachers have an alter ego? And so I was one of those kids who grew up not wanting to be a teacher, actually. I was not one of those ones who was born teaching, you know, their dolls and things when they were little. I wanted nothing to do with education for a very long time. I had a high school English teacher who told me I'd make a great teacher someday, but didn't really paid too much attention to it, went and got 2 degrees in political science and realized that there was something missing. So I had recently moved back home and decided to go and try my hand at substitute teaching as a job. And so I went into an 8th grade class after spring break, which for those who are educators will find that absolutely hilarious. And it was a wild and crazy day. These kids thought they had hit the jackpot, you know, brand new substitute right after spring break. But I went home that day and I remember sitting on the couch, absolutely mentally, physically, emotionally exhausted. And my mom looked at me and she's like, "Oh my God, what did they do to you?" I said, "Man, I don't know, but I'm going back tomorrow." And that was it. So I knew I went back, got a degree, another degree, my teacher certification, and then was a high school social studies teacher for 17 years, and partly in the town where I grew up, which I really enjoyed. Then became the New Jersey State Teacher of the Year in 2012, which was a pretty amazing experience. It's one of those things where you learn so much in such a short time. And for me, it was literally and figuratively, you couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. And so I knew with everything I learned, I had to sort of expand and grow. So I ended up going to higher education. I was recruited by my alma mater to go back and help out in the teacher preparation department. So I was in charge of strategic partnerships, where it was my job to redesign our fieldwork program and work with all of our district partners. And recently I have just signed on to be the executive director for the Center for Future Educators, which is an organization that works on recruiting high school and middle school students to become educators and also working to diversify the pipeline. So I feel very lucky that the job I have now is sort of a accumulation of everything that I've ever learned. And I'm glad to be able to apply it and network and help inspire the next generation.
And I'm so glad that Jeanne is out of the bottle, no pun intended, of course. Michael Horn, who's Michael Horn?
Absolutely. Well, first, it's so good to be with you all. Gerard, always a good day when I get to spend time with you, sir. But I got into education by accident as well, I guess. So maybe that's going to be a theme here. I had a public policy and writing background. I went to business school to get away from it, if I'm being truthful. And while there, I took Clay Christensen's class on innovation and how to sustain organizations for the long haul. And the theories that were taught, these theories of disruptive innovation, jobs to be done, et cetera, that were taught just totally changed my worldview about how organizations in all sorts of sectors operated and allowed me to see things very differently. And toward the end of class in November, he offhandedly one day said, "If anyone's interested in writing a book on public K-12 education, why don't you come by and stop by my office afterwards and we'll see if we can do that together." And I stopped by, not to write the book, but to check about a paper I was writing for the class. And at the very end, I said, "You know, I have a writing background, public policy background. To work with you, did you really mean co-author?" And he said, "Yes, I did." And so one thing led to another, and we wrote the book together, Disrupting Class, started the Clay Christensen Institute together. And then, you know, you wake up and you realize this is what you believe in, that what you've put down on pages, that creating a student-centered environment in which every individual has the opportunity to build their passions and fulfill their human potential is what you want to do every single day. And so that just sort of fed on itself, and however many years later, still doing that in a range of the education sectors.
glad that you remain in the sector, and your writing has been really important to the way I think. So thanks for sharing that story.
Thank you.
So we have Jennifer. Who is
Well,
Jennifer?
I am so delighted to be here with this distinguished group. So I grew up in rural North Carolina, and I am 56 years old. And in rural North Carolina, back when I was a kid, they didn't know very much about disabilities, particularly non-visible ones. And as it happens, I'm dyslexic. I also have ADHD, and no one figured it out. They were like, well, she seems really pretty bright, but she's not learning. She must be kind of stubborn or not trying. So I am somebody with disabilities who really became a non-traditional learner. I'm 5'10", stopped growing when I was 12. Couldn't read until I had stopped growing, even was already 5'10". Really had challenges reading. And now I'm a parent. And as a parent, I know what it's like to raise a child with disabilities. And I've been able to achieve the American dream. My husband's been able to achieve the American dream. But there are so many barriers for children with disabilities, particularly those in a single parent family, particularly those who are facing structural racism in terms of how we fund our school systems, which means they might not have the early intervention and diagnosis. And so I've become pretty obsessed with the 6 million plus children with disabilities, 800,000 of whom are also English language learners. So I'm delighted to be on this panel, and I get to work with Gerard on a regular basis, and just love your work. So thank you, and it's good to be with these folks.
Thank you for sharing your personal story. And thank you also for opening up about your own disability, because it's going to let other people say, you know what, I'm not the only one. Thanks a lot. Michael, let's go to you. Who's Michael?
Yeah, so thanks, Gerard, for inviting me on today. It's great to be with such a distinguished panel. For my part, I've worked in public policy for over 20 years, started off on Capitol Hill for about 8 years. Of that 20 years, a lot of it was not actually spent on education, or at least not directly. However, it's probably safe to say a few things happened along the way that really inspired an interest in getting involved in education policy, specifically on the private school side of the equation. First, when I lived in Kansas and was running the state Catholic conference there, I got heavily involved in the school choice movement. We ended up passing the state's first school choice law in 2014. It was a very eye-opening experience, and it was a great accomplishment to be a part of, but I also very much came away with the feeling that there was more work to be done. I guess the second factor that really drove an interest in education policy was that I had kids. Guess as a technical matter, my wife had them, but suffice it to say, when they started going to school, I really found myself thinking more and more about what I wanted for them educationally. And as I started to get my arms around that, the question really staring me in the face became, how do I make this happen for them? Finally, any of your viewers or any of the other panelists who have maybe classically minded tastes may know about the integrated humanities program they had at the University of Kansas in the 1970s and 80s, led by Jeanne Sr. and others. It's a really interesting and amazing story, which I was introduced to at the same time as these other developments, working on the school choice stuff, passing that bill, my kids getting of school age. So that all kind of happened, intersected at the same time. It all conspired to turn me into someone with an interest in education advocacy, and incidentally turned me into a dad that's always hounding his kids to read Homer and memorize some poetry and to clean their rooms. So that's my story.
And I believe you're a dad of 6 children.
That's correct.
So you've got a lot of reading to do.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot
Thanks
of
so much for joining us. And you were in Capitol Hill, and you still survive to tell a story. So that's actually a good thing.
Yes, I'm a survivor.
You're a survivor. Thomas, who is Thomas, or who is Tom?
First and foremost, it's a pleasure to be with you, Gerard, and the distinguished panelists, as others have said. I appreciate Jeanne and Jennifer's backgrounds, and it's rare that I'll get a chance to talk a little bit about what I'll say by way of who am I within the context of a conversation about COVID, K-20 education, as well as advancements in equity, diversity, and inclusion, where now plays a significant role. But I think I'd have to pay homage to affirmative action first and foremost. I think I'm a return on investment of affirmative action. I mean, the letter of affirmative action was an attempt to go into really poor communities, identify individuals, as Jennifer mentioned, that don't get the kind of support that they need, and therefore their test scores, their grades would not make them competitive for various post-secondary institutions. And the hope was, by going into those communities and schools and providing access to exceptional learning opportunities, those individuals would go back. We abandoned affirmative action probably 3 or 4 years into its implementation, where a lot of institutions started to go into Catholic schools and suburban schools to recruit students of color, particularly low income. And those people didn't go back to inner city communities because they didn't come from them. So for me, I left Harvard University with a PhD and no debt. However, I started with 2 years in foster care in Washington, DC, at a large central facility called DC Junior Village. I was a product of the DC public schools. Jeanne, I hated school because it was an uncomfortable place. A lot of violence. There wasn't a lot of room among my peers to excel. My parents don't have high school diplomas, so it should be no surprise that I barely made it out of high school, went into the military, and that's where things turned around for me. I learned to learn in the military, where there was a universal standard in terms of what was expected of all of us, and that was the catalyst for me leaving, going back to the University of District of Columbia, my undergraduate alma mater, where I went from a student who could barely write. My writing skills were probably at about a 9th grade level. And the first thing I had to overcome was sitting down with a tutor and accepting at the age of 20, 21 that I couldn't write when there was an expectation that I could because I had a high school diploma. And it was a very humbling experience. And that didn't stop at UDC. And I think it was because of affirmative action, Harvard gave me a shot. While there, I wrote my dissertation on the evolution of prisons in America and connected that to poverty and inner city experiences, with an understanding that there was a fork in the road for me and a lot of people like me that often leads to jails and prisons as part of the underground economy, and not really criminal behavior. I would argue, if you don't have the skill sets and the knowledge economy to take advantage of opportunities, then you're destined for bumping into the law, so to speak. So I felt obligated throughout my career to give back, to pay, as I said, a return on affirmative action. I'm proud to say I was co-founder and head of school at Seed School, where coming out of grad school, it's an opportunity to help students much like me from tenuous families and neighborhoods to hopefully think about learning from a different perspective and getting them excited about it. That I went on to 20 years later to co-found University Now, which I think Michael may be familiar with. We wanted to build a very unique model for working adults who were like those children, who didn't get their fair shot, that would not lead to debt. And I now play a role at the National University System, as you described, ensuring that all of our universities do something really unique, particularly in the online environment. We have 45,000 students, but 90% of them are online. And through this conversation, I'd love to make a distinction between online learning by default versus online learning by design. I think it has wonderful opportunities for students who didn't get a fair shot, like me, before the 8th grade, before 12th grade. And then lastly, I mean, you and I go back to Bayo. We both co-founders. You were the president of Black Alliance for Educational Options, which is just another opportunity to help advance school choice, school reform. And as always, as others have said, been a pleasure working with you, and couldn't think of a better thing to do on a beautiful day here in Oakland.
Thank you, Tom, so much for sharing your story. And just to piggyback on something he said, he's a graduate of the University of the District of Columbia, which is one of our public historically Black colleges and universities. And he's also the he's first graduate of UDC to earn a PhD at Harvard and then return back to do some great work. As you hear and see, for those who are watching, we've got people who've arrived to the education forefront through some similar paths and through some unique paths. But every one of us today are here because we believe, and as Jennifer said, the American dream and how we get there. We know again with 2020, it was a very interesting time. So much so that the founder and a couple of our scholars at the Institute recently published Democracy in Dark Times. You can find a copy of this on our webpage. And it focuses not only on politics, but also education and expectations and why that's important. And I want to use that as a backdrop to say that in a year where race, gender, religious liberties were at the forefront, where issues of equity really rose to the forefront, access to technology was a really big issue. All of you have been impacted by that one way or another. So what I'm going to do is actually just jump into some of the individual questions. As I share, you can feel free to weigh in. Jennifer, let me start with you. You work for a very innovative entrepreneurial nonprofit organization. You've done some incredibly important things with lawmakers, with the private sector, and with government this year. Talk about some of the things you're doing as relates to people, both children and adults with disabilities through your lane.
Thank you, Gerard. So respectability is really very innovative in that we focus on three different things. First is fighting those stigmas and low expectations that undermine students with disabilities' ability to achieve. So that's why we're working in Hollywood and with the news media, for example, and looking for best practices that need to be replicated, which is why we work so much with the government, elected officials, the school system, et cetera, and then the authentic talent pipeline. The idea that people with disabilities generally know what's best for people with disabilities because they have that lived experience. And I will add that the disability community has a lot of really robust nonprofits that do extremely good work, but they tend to be founded by two-parent white families of relative privilege. But if you look at that 6 to 7 million students with disabilities today, the majority are children of color, and they're not really represented in the leadership of most of the disability organizations. And we really need to be very intersectional in how we think about racism and ableism compounding itself. So how do we look at COVID? I mean, we look at COVID from really Maslow's hierarchy of needs. On one hand, a two-parent white family with plenty of space and lots of computers, this distance learning, it might not be their favorite first choice, but they can pull it off. But we're talking about, in reality, a lot of families for whom that school lunch was extremely important. And so too was access to food stamps through the SNAP program. And one of the earliest things that we discovered was that SNAP only worked in person in 46 of America's states. So if you were blind or you used a wheelchair, you were literally forced to go to the grocery store in person to show your food stamps, your EBT card. And so the first thing that we did was try and get that changed, which actually legally needed to be done in a different way, in a different time and paperwork in every single state. So today in 46 of America's states, 9.9 million people with disabilities can access food via online delivery. And that food nutrition is so important for learning. A lot of kids have been really, really hungry because they didn't have access to safe food supply and they didn't have those school lunches. And of course, this access to internet is a really big problem. And the mental health of these high expectations that continued in some cases, but the delivery of services, the schools are really collapsing in terms of their delivery of services, particularly for students with disabilities. There's already a shortage of special needs teachers, a real shortage, a critical shortage of qualified support speech therapists, occupational therapists. How do you deliver that service when you're in distance learning environment? Hard enough to try and teach math, never mind speech therapy or occupational therapy. So there've been a lot of significant issues. I think, that I don't want to take too much time, but I think the bottom line is that I've become very philosophical, and I don't feel that this is a sprint. This is a marathon. A child with a disability, of which we have almost 7 million in our country today, we want to prepare them for a lifetime of success where they too can achieve as much of the American dream as their skills and their interest and passion will take them. And so we can't force them necessarily to learn what they're supposed to learn this year on the same timetable where they would have learned it in person when they got all the services that they needed. I think we have to prioritize physical health. We have to prioritize mental health. For a lot of these kids, they might need an extra year of school. Legally, students can stay in school until they're 21. Some of these students are going to need an extra year. And I think we have to give them that mulligan and really prioritize the long term. We have a light at the end of the tunnel. It is no longer a train. We see these vaccines coming. And I think that next year we'll be back in classrooms and it'll be much better. But meantime, I think what Michael Horn said about intentional, online learning by design has been a lot of lessons learned. And there will be some things that come out of this in the long term that are very good from what we've learned about some capabilities for online telehealth and online education.
It's so good, Jennifer, to hear you say that you're looking at this philosophically and that it's actually a marathon and not a sprint. And hopefully those of us who are looking at this through the lens of philosophy are looking at it more through a positive lens versus nihilism. But that's a whole other conversation for a whole other group. Jeanne, let me pivot to you. You've spent time in the classroom and now you're in another position to educate the next generation of teachers who woke up in September to realize teaching looked a lot different, those who are in the classroom and those who are preparing. What are some of your thoughts about what the profession will look like and your role in helping prepare people?
Well, I know in some of the early conversations with teacher friends, the conversation was what was normal will never be normal again, that we can't go back to what was normal, because I think now, although we always knew it was inequitable, it is really glaringly inequitable now. So there are some big changes that need to happen. When March hit and we were, our student teachers and our teacher candidates were in classrooms going through their certification process, at least they had the benefit of being live and in person from January through March. So they had at least a little bit of some in-person time, which was really important. But starting in September, when students were entirely virtual or hybrid or whatever the case was, it presented an entirely different set of challenges. And so, although it has been a stressful time, I always look at disruption as the opportunity to change with very little resistance, because during times like this, there is nothing that is normal. So why can't you try something new? It is a good opportunity to innovate and try and come up with some new ideas about what things like teacher preparation should look like. And so I think one of the things we need to start thinking more about is the idea of mutually beneficial partnerships. For a long time, teacher preparation has been sort of a lopsided proposition, where the school districts felt like they were taking on a lot of the responsibility, and the benefits were all sort of they were all received by the student teacher or the university preparation program. And so I think now this gives us the opportunity to really take a look at those relationships. One of the things we had to do was innovate in order to place students in schools this fall. We had a lot of districts that outright said, no, it's too stressful. We're stretched. Our budgets are cut. We don't have enough people. Our candidates, our teachers are already stressed out enough trying to do hybrid learning, et cetera, et cetera. We said, whoa, hold on a second. Have you heard about co-teaching? Our student teachers can co-teach, which this is a perfect opportunity, because now you have the opportunity for parallel education. One teaches the kids who are in person, one teaches the kids who are online at the same time. I said that way it works. When we first went virtual in March, for a lot of our teacher candidates who are very, very savvy digital natives, they helped their mentor teachers get their online systems up and running, and they were able to get in touch with parents and walk parents through how to get things done. So I think those that had student teachers or teacher candidates realize how valuable they are, but those who sort of look at teacher preparation through an older lens of what it used to be, the dump and run, are thinking that this is not such why would I take a student teacher now? Why would I take a candidate now? And the answer is because they are really, really helpful. We've had partnerships with some districts where the students have been allowed to substitute teach on days that they weren't actually accumulating their hours. So it's beneficial to the school districts who are desperate for substitute teachers, especially ones who are tech savvy and who know the school, while also providing some extra income for our teacher candidates. Because let's face it, COVID has hit them as well. They have lost their part-time jobs, and many of them relied on those jobs to put them through school. If they have families, it may be that their kids are now home and they're trying to learn at the same time. Maybe we had some students who didn't have computers, and these are college kids who relied on the computer lab at college, who now could no longer rely on that. We have students who had anxiety that has now just been exacerbated. We are seeing huge, anxiety was a growing issue before the pandemic. Now it is just unbelievable. So I think this is a great opportunity for higher ed and teacher preparation in particular to think about partnerships. What can we do in conjunction with districts? One district we worked with said, okay, great. How many teachers do you want? We'll in return offer you Google Classroom training to make sure that all of your teachers are trained on how to use the new platforms that they need, while our candidates are trained at the same time with you. So you're able to actually work together and bounce ideas off of each other and move things forward. But it takes sometimes some external help as well. So for some of these, can we offer professional development? Could we offer more technology? Could we offer hotspots? Well, as a university, we may not have the funding to do that, but if you're a private organization that is willing to help by donating some things towards a good cause and willing to see a great outcome, then this might be a great opportunity for business to also get involved with some of these university and district partnerships to help advance them beyond to where they are. But I think the moral of the story here is there is no more normal. We can't go back to what it was because we realized that there were things that need fixing. And so we need to do better and in moving forward and making sure that we are allowing for both virtual and in person. And we know that the budget cuts are coming. We know if the money isn't passed, there was just a statement that was out by ECS the other day, Education Commission of the States. School Superintendent Association said we need 1.7 billion in newer and unanticipated, I'm sorry, 1.7 million per district in new and unanticipated costs to fully reopen. CCSSO said we need between 158 and 224 billion in additional funding to reopen and enable safe and equitable learning for all students. We've got a lot of work to do, and we're gonna have to be creative in how we get there. So I think, university, school, business partnerships are gonna be the way to go for the future.
It's so good to hear you talk about partnerships, because in more of a metaphorical aspect, we have to work in partnership to sail like Noah did the seas of uncertainty, because the new normal isn't normal anymore. So thanks for talking about partnerships and for the work you're doing to say, listen, let me get ahead of this and reach out, because some superintendents and school boards are doing great work, but they also need someone like you to push and say, well, how about we do this? Michael, let's turn to you, actually, Michael Horn. You live for disruption. It's part of what you do. It's in your DNA. In times like this, this is where people like you and those who are in entrepreneurship, rise to the occasion. Talk to us about some of the challenges and obstacles, but also some of the opportunities that innovators, both in technology, education, and combination, have done this year to try to soften the blow that Jennifer happened to mention for her constituents, and the same thing with Jeanne for hers.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. And unless people think we're totally tone deaf, I'll say we never lived for this sort of a disruption. But when we think about disruption or disruptive innovation, one of the hallmarks is it's these new innovations that take root in areas where the alternative is nothing at all, right? And obviously, the pandemic has created a lot of those opportunities, as Jennifer and Jeanne both said, like where there's not going to be that pushback from the existing system because there are voids that we need to fill. I think the big challenge for entrepreneurs launching potentially disruptive offerings in this landscape, just to name it up front, is the question that has been posed a few times, right? Which is, we know we shouldn't go back to what was there before as the vaccine rolls out, but will we? Will parents just sort of flock back and say, yeah, I sort of the veil was lifted before my eyes, right? But the childcare and all these things are overriding that I'd rather just go back to the system as it was rather than use this as an opportunity to rethink so many parts of our system. And so from an entrepreneur's perspective, I think that frames the opportunity and the challenge right now that they have before them. The opportunity is to prove yourself right now, to be really engaging, to be that indispensable tool that shows, hey, in partnership with educators and with students, you need me because you can do X so much better to reach every single individual who perhaps was being left behind right before. And, you look at an innovation like OutSchool, for example, they offer, teachers can teach online courses on their platform. They initially were targeting homeschool students. They're obviously now really serving a lot of students in districts and throughout the country in a variety of ways. Can they make their impact felt that people say, yeah, actually, we want to continue to have that, right? When schools really truly reopen and there's a vaccine and the population has more herd immunity and so forth, that's the opportunity that they have to prove themselves. I'll say at the same time, I think we've seen a lot of terrific entrepreneurs over the years in places like mathematics education or literacy and stuff like that. And yet, maybe it's not as engaging as it needs to be, such that we're sort of constantly towing the line between rigor and engagement. I'm not sure we found that sweet spot, or students would sort of be propelling themselves far more through the material than they are at the moment. So there's an opportunity there. It's also a challenge. A third piece I would say is the infrastructure. And part of that is, we know our most vulnerable students and communities don't have equitable access to broadband and the computers and devices that they need. So how do you feel that when you're an entrepreneur with a technology solution, right, coming into the market? But I would also point to, what Jeanne mentioned, which is we should be seeing a lot more teaching as a team sport. She talked about taking teachers who are, student teachers and pairing them with existing teachers to provide new models of support. But I would say, in general, we need to figure out how do we increase the value of every single human interaction in a learning environment, whether that's remote or in person. And what we're seeing right now is that you can't do remote learning without those. Without really good interaction between human beings, between teachers and students. That's really important. And so here's where the micro schools that we've seen emerge, I would like them to be far more creative with their partnerships with districts to create in-person opportunities or opportunities for teachers to be out in the field in safe environments with far fewer students, right? To provide the support that they need, and maybe not envision that everything needs to occur in a school building. In higher education, I'll just say, I think a lot of companies right now, and I know this from my seat at Guild Education, where I'm a senior strategist, we've seen so many companies just invest a ton to accelerate existing plans they already had in place, to digitize, automate, start using artificial intelligence far more than they were. And that is going to have a huge impact on the jobs available and the replacement of certain jobs far faster than we thought. And so there's a huge imperative, not just to let that happen, but to upskill and reskill these frontline employees across the country right now, working adults, so that they can step into the roles that are going to be needed for these companies to continue to excel and so forth. And our higher ed sector and our informal learning sector in the adult learning space, the huge opportunity. I mean, I know National's doing a lot in that space, right? Like, these are big opportunities to step up and reskill, because there's going to be demand and there are going to be novel ways to pay for it as well, because it's going to be directly in the interest of the businesses to upskill their workforce to meet the demand that they're going to have as we see these structural changes occur. So those are sort of some early thoughts, I guess, across it. The only other thing I would say is, we need to keep pushing on the imagination and keep pushing the rules that were made for a particular circumstance that just don't fit the one we're in right now. And we need to rethink flexibility of how teachers team with each other. What are different hours and ways of creating coverage? How do we re-envision the personal supports at all levels of this so that we can provide every learner what they need? And I think entrepreneurs need to be partners in that conversation, not just sort of trying to take dead aim and somehow replace it or think that they can do it by themselves.
Great points. And thank you also for making that very nuanced distinction about what disruptive really means and not looking for this type of disruption. When I heard you say that, I thought about Septima Clark, who's a former educator in the South and a human rights activist, who says that I actually enjoy chaos. She said, because from chaos comes creativity. So I know it's in the spirit of which we're working. The other Michael, let's take a have a conversation with you. You know, you represent a very diverse set of private schools that are non-sectarian, private that are Christian, both Protestant, Catholic, and you have Jewish and other groups who are also under the umbrella of your work. Talk to us about what 2020 has meant for your sector and some of the things that you've seen that you'd like to share with us, whether it's obstacles, but also opportunities.
Sure. Well, it's been a year we won't soon forget. COVID-19 has absolutely been the dominant fact of the year 2020, a year that can't end fast enough, by the way. I have to say, a little digression. Normally, New Year's is my least favorite holiday. The older I get, the less I like it. Another year gone by, I'm that much older, etc. But this year, I will definitely be staying up till midnight, dancing and toasting like never before. I am ready to get this year over with. It's been a tough one for everybody, and private schools have not been immune at all. COVID has turned education upside down in an unprecedented way across the board. Back in March, when everything shut down, private schools across the country scrambled to go virtual. By all accounts, they did a really outstanding job adapting on the fly. Take my kid's school, for instance. It's a liberal arts school and what you might call the classical tradition. The students aren't allowed to bring iPhones or iPads or anything like that to school. It's a very old school approach. So suffice it to say, it's not a place that bases its pedagogy on technology. However, in March, they just absolutely turned on a dime, went virtual. The first week was a little choppy, a little rough, but they adjusted, they adapted, and I think the spring in the end went about as well as could be hoped for. That said, it was nonetheless a very scary time for private education. We have the benefit of hindsight now, but at the time, there was genuine fear that COVID could be an existential situation for private schools. As you know, private schools depend upon tuition and philanthropy. When the economy shut down, people lost their jobs. Many parents were no longer able to pay tuition. The spring fundraisers, which are so important to private schools, were canceled. A lot of religious schools receive their financial support through an affiliated church, and the churches were closed. So there were no more collection baskets on Sunday. It was a very difficult situation, and private schools were really staring into the abyss, and our families were wondering what was going to happen. There was real fear that private schools would close en masse. And if that happened, not only would families suffer the loss of their school, but it would seriously increase the burden on public schools and the cost to taxpayers. If huge numbers of private school kids were surged into the public school system, when the public schools were already asking Congress for aid themselves, it would have been a huge problem for everybody. Time went on, spring became summer, and with the approach of fall, there was tremendous uncertainty. In the end, the large majority, I would say, of private schools physically reopened for in-classroom learning. And the evidence seems to suggest that our schools have not been a problem as far as the spread of COVID. It's looked pretty good in that respect. So that's been a great success. But there are still storm clouds on the horizon. As a let me preface this by saying that getting data for the entire private school landscape isn't easy, but what we've seen suggests that enrollment is probably down. The economy was just devastating for so many people. Certainly some schools have held steady or even increased their enrollment. In some places, we've seen students from public schools that didn't reopen in person coming over to the local private school, but on the whole, we're most likely looking at an enrollment decline, maybe a significant one. And many experts believe that the real pain won't be felt for another year or two as far as the consequences of this all working itself out. It's obviously tough to see into the future. Private schools, frankly, have also suffered because of the unfortunate way that the CARES Act was drafted. I think, as everybody knows, the CARES Act was the big COVID relief bill passed by Congress in March. It contained K through 12 aid for schools. Private schools were included, but in a way that has meant that thousands of private schools have seen little or no relief. So these schools have been digging deep to pay for whatever is needed to make for safe classrooms in the COVID area. And let me tell you, this stuff isn't free. They haven't received the help we've been hoping for. Another challenge now we're facing in certain places, government agencies that are attempting to temporarily shut down private schools that have been open this fall. It's happening in Kentucky, where the AG and the governor are on opposite sides. There's new litigation just this week in Michigan. There's litigation over this in Wisconsin. There are complicated rules in California for reopening that have made it really tough for private schools in some places to provide in-person learning across all grades. New York City, there have been issues with the city government not providing the testing for COVID services to private schools that state law says they should provide. So it's been a season of tremendous challenges for our schools. But I think it's also a time that we can all be proud of that work in private education. Our schools opened in the face of a lot of uncertainty. I mentioned the CARES Act issues. While that was all being argued over, the Department of Education and others had different interpretations over this. Private schools nonetheless went full steam ahead, spending their own money to get their classrooms ready for the fall. We've heard about schools upgrading their buildings with HVAC filters, new windows, plexiglass dividers, spacing. They've paid for extra cleaning. They've even found ways in these difficult economic times to increase financial aid to students in need and families. This obviously varies from school to school. Some could afford to do more than others. That said, I must say there is a mistaken impression that private schools are all these wealthy enclaves for the 1% walled off from normal people. There are some very wealthy schools out there, but most of the private schools I know don't fall in that category. They're moving heaven and earth to keep the bills paid. Teachers are often working for less than they could get elsewhere because they support that school's mission. Private schools are in their communities serving the common good, and I think a lot more people realize that now. So interesting times.
In fact, thank you for the update. There's a couple of things. When you mentioned the decline, I'm thinking about what took place with private schools during the Great Recession, nearly 11% decrease. And then there's also a recent study published by an organization of private school budget officers who surveyed, I think, a little more than 100 schools and identified that in the majority, they actually saw an uptick in the number of people who were applying. And so it's good to see some uptake, but also realizing there's going to be some challenges. Tom, let's go to you because you're at higher ed level. We've talked about K-12, higher ed equally impacted, as Jennifer knows, hundreds of thousands of students with disabilities are also in higher ed. And so talk to us about what National University is doing as it relates to equity, as it relates to social justice and issues of inclusion, because other schools or other higher education institutions by default had to go online. You took a different approach. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, great question. And I must admit that all of the panelists have said something that has my mind spinning. And like Jennifer, I too am ADHD. And the beauty of it is I like working on multiple projects, get a lot of enthusiasm from it, but I've got to be in a very controlled environment. So when I'm writing or reading or doing something that requires intense focus. So I'm finding this panel to be a good balance of both. I'll just say by way of background to answer your question, as I think about what's unfolding with COVID online and listening to some of the panelists talk about K-12 education, I'm reminded of a lot of the work you and I did, Gerard, particularly in the charter school arena, where I was blown away as someone, public school product, who has the best interests of people that I care about. And the people I care about most are really low income, regardless of ethnicity or race. I feel like that's the common denominator between me and most people I have bonded with over time. And it just so happens that I'm African American, and and being of color kind of helps with some of this work. But Michael Horn said something about fit, and for me, it's not whether charter schools are better than public versus private. It's creating as many options as possible, and then allowing the student and their family as advocates to figure out whether they have a disability or they have a special interest in a certain subject, to figure out that school or learning opportunity that's best for them. What frustrated me the most about K-12 was all the fist fighting you had to do in order to be an advocate. I mean, and often families and community activists were barriers to an individual student's or group of students' development. So what I like most about post-secondary is I learned some really valuable lessons in K-12 that I think are transferable. And I like dealing with people because we serve adult learners. Many of them have the same characteristics of K-12-like students, but now they're adults. And you don't have to talk to their parents or talk to their teacher or the principal about what's best for them. And what we're learning at the K-12 level is that the greatest opportunity, at least the work that I've done, is with those working adults who are now mature enough, they overcome the stigma they felt. And Jennifer, one thought that came to mind in terms of exercising, for example, at the K-12 level, the option to stay until you're 21. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that a lot of students should not accept that degree because you forfeit the resources that are still available to you. But on the other hand, I think exercising that opportunity has to be done in an environment that doesn't feel negative to them, right? Because most people at 18 want to graduate with their cohort. If they decide not to graduate and they continue going to that building, something was wrong with them, right? So how do we create safe spaces between 18 and 21 for students who didn't get it, before 18? And I think we can do a lot of that online. So the comments I want to make about online, I just want the panelists and the audience to know, for me, it's not zero sum. It's how do we create the best set of opportunities for learners and help them develop the consumer skills, right? Which is the other thing, right? K-12, I've started 15 charter schools, led 3 of them. And one of the things that blew me away were how low-income parents would flock to this new school, not knowing its true value compared to the school down the street. And in many cases, a new school will take 5 years to reach a point where it may be performing at the level of the local school, right? So you don't magically start a school and it's the thing it says it wants to be in its charter. It takes sometimes 10 years for some entrepreneurs if they lack the resources and other supports to get their schools there. And I think the same thing is about to happen online. So it brings me to your question. COVID, as Michael and others have said, has by default forced people to entertain online learning. However, some people are bringing old, ineffective classroom, school-based processes often called pedagogy at the K-12 level, into an environment at the post-secondary level that's really andragogy. It's how adults learn. And what we're learning is our average customer or student will make family, school, number 1 and 2. We don't have the luxury of creating an opportunity for them that will compete with those 2 priorities. But instead, we try to build something that's consistent with their lifestyle. So that's one. And I think the other thing that we're learning about students who leave K-12, often ill-equipped, it's not only about the lack of exposure to subject matter, but not understanding the mechanics of learning and the process associated with learning, time management, organization. And there are a lot of companies that are building those tools. So if you didn't get it before you were 18 or 21, there are some expedited ways you could potentially get it, using technology that does an assessment at the beginning of every class that tells you what you know and you don't know. So it's not a guess. You don't have to wait until the end of the 16-week term or semester to see what the instructor gives you in terms of what you knew and didn't know and what you developed and learned during that period of time. So all that said, my role at National University System is to ensure that our institutions, because we have about 90% of our students online, we have mostly professional programs, graduate level programs, and the hope is that a lot of the students we serve got better at the bachelor degree level, and we can take them to the next level. And we want to create an experience that ensures that the inequalities and the discriminatory practices that often existed from a traditional standpoint, don't take root, aren't transferred into the online environment. And a lot of institutions are bringing to online in the short run what's essentially correspondence, right? Versus entrepreneurs who are, building state-of-the-art learning management systems that some of the traditional institutions, because of lack of funding, and Michael S., I think, described something at the private school level that is afflicting a lot of universities and colleges, is that they don't have the resources to make this dramatic shift to online learning. So many of them are making very modest to low investments, trying to ride out COVID and then turn back to their traditional modalities. I believe, as Jeanne mentioned, that there's going to be a healthy balance, I think, when the dust settles between traditional practices and online in a form of hybrid. And I think that's the opportunity that's being created via COVID.
I'm glad you mentioned correspondence, because correspondence education has been around for over a century in the United States. And when we think online, we think it's the first time that we've had a chance to deliver education in a certain way when it's taken place. I've actually got a group question, but I have one panelist, actually one attendee, who's from Ethiopia. And she sent me a note, so I want to make sure I give her, this person, an opportunity to ask a question. So Dan, we're going to open up the question, and forgive me for the pronunciation. Miseli? You can turn your mic on, and then you can ask your question. Okay, well, we'll wait for that to take place. Here's a general question. All of you have touched on points within your lane that you walk for education. You've also acknowledged where your colleagues have made points that you said, you know what, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about it that way. If we're having this conversation December 10th, 2021, what's one thing you would say we did right? Or better yet, what would you say is a victory a year from now when we have this conversation about 2021? What would look different, whether it's your lane or another lane? And I'll sit back and anyone can join in as you'd like.
I'll play off Jennifer really quickly, and then Jennifer, you just raised your hand, so maybe you can jump in from there. But you mentioned that some people, will need to evaluate the time people will need based on individuals, and give some people more time to recover their learning or I hate the notion of learning loss, but right, to tackle learning that maybe they haven't had the chance to get to have the opportunity to do yet. If in a year from now, we're thinking about this in terms of mastery-based learning or competency-based learning, as opposed to, oh, gee, you're a certain age and therefore you have X number of years left of school, I think that would be a tremendous advance forward, where we're looking truly at each individual and asking what do they need to succeed, making time the variable, but the learning non-negotiable in terms of the foundation. I think that would be a tremendous step forward.
Are you talking competency-based learning versus seat time-based learning? Okay, gotcha.
Exactly. Yep.
Jennifer.
I think that's a great point. I will also say that COVID isn't the only epidemic that we've been facing, and the racial justice issues have been extremely acute. And I think the upside of that has been the learning that a lot of people have really taken in to try and make things better on that front. So one thing I would like to see is a move away from cops in school and a move towards more mental health supports in school. I think that'll be core critical.
Good point. And in defund the police conversations, in some of those conversations, it was defund and with that money fund the kind of resources you're talking about. So thanks for bringing that up.
Absolutely. If I can just add on that one of the challenges of online learning is that people are at home where there's people who look like them and think like them. And one of the positive things about an in-person learning environment is that you're with people who look different than you and think differently from you, and that you start to become more accepting of people with differences. And I think that we have a real challenge that people have been more divided. They've gone into their tents where some people watch MSNBC and other people watch Fox. We're going to have to bring together and unify when we're back in person across ideologies and across all kinds of differences that'll make a more inclusive and accepting society. And I think that public school is one of the places where that can really happen. And I think that in private school, diversity efforts can advance that. And I'd love to see more people with disabilities involved in diversity efforts inside the private school system as well.
Thank you. Jeanne.
And sort of piggybacking off of both of those ideas, in thinking about schools, my new job is to recruit middle school and high school kids to the education profession, and also to work on diversifying that pipeline. So what I would like to see is different kids who may not have thought about education as a possibility before, once they saw what happened online, that they go, you know what, I could do that. I could create technology that would help. I could be the guidance counselor that students need. I could be the special education teacher because I know what people are looking for. So I'm looking for people beyond who normally would want to be teachers, which tends to be those, you know, middle class white girls. I want other folks to think about wanting to become educators. And I think also the whole landscape of the country, especially through the summer, Black Lives Matter, I want activist educators. I want people who are interested in not only working with kids, but working towards social justice in schools and willing to have those conversations. And so I think for me, a year from now, if I'm able to recruit more students of color, more kids who are non-traditional teachers to come to the profession, people who you know, don't necessarily want to teach elementary school all the time, but, you know, kids who are maybe thinking about going into a career or in biology or chemistry or physics, who then turn around and say, but you know what, I have something to offer. I like to mentor. I like to work within my community. I like to work towards activism. And I think education might be the place for me. So for me, that's going to be creating a new generation of educator.
I'm glad you brought up the part about trying to get students who are in school now to think about that, because we just don't do a lot of that. In a previous life, I worked for DC Public Schools when Arlene Ackerman was superintendent, and it may have been Eastern High School, but it was before we got there, but either the 80s or the 90s, a foundation funded that high school to get high school students to work with people like you to think about that. So if there's some programs now, you know, that of course you're doing that, send me resources. I'll make sure we send this out, because that is something we often overlook. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Michael?
if I could jump in.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, one of the apparent losers of COVID is something that I'm hoping we can address within the next year, which are women, generally speaking. A lot of them are being forced home, and things that I've read suggest that women are being set back decades in terms of the advancements that they've made from a professional career perspective. And I'm hoping we can be proactive about what we can do to help expedite getting them back on track with their careers. And implicit in that, and not only just for women, but all students. And one of the things that we see at the post-secondary level are individuals who are students pursuing something for practical reasons associated with income, versus, whether it's teaching or some other profession that you're passionate about, that, it speaks to who you are and what impact you want to have. And my hope is that COVID is slowing down the world and the country enough that we all can reflect and figure out during this hiatus of sorts, what really motivates me and how can I begin to pursue that from a professional standpoint as part of essentially recreating myself and taking advantage of opportunities in the future.
Good points. Michael, we'll go to you, and then I've got the question from our colleague in Ethiopia, and I've got a follow-up.
Me, Michael?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry about that, Michael.
Yeah. So the question was, what would we look at a year from now and think?
What would you consider a win?
Yes. I appreciate the point that extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. And I would be thrilled if a year from now, parents were just given more freedom to choose the education that they think is best for their kids. I think this fall has been a case study for some parents in what happens when they don't have those options, especially low-income families that can't afford to move somewhere else or to afford private school tuition. I would just like to see, as Congress thinks about ways of helping families afford to make it through this crisis, that helping families afford the school of their choice, the educational option of their choice, that would be on the menu
Okay.
at the federal and at the state level.
When you mentioned families moving, I live in Charlottesville. There are a number of families who've actually moved here from where they were for a host of reasons. Some is education, but it's interesting because for some adults, they're moving because if the children are online anyway and not in person, let me take an opportunity to live in a different place I may have wanted to. So there's some very interesting public-private dynamics. I've got two questions. One was from our friend from Ethiopia who said, Ethiopia has been impacted by COVID-19. What recommendations do you have? One of our speakers in a previous panel in September, Eric Kanyushek, has written a really good article on COVID-19 and the economics of it and how it's impacted schools in the United States and those who are members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And the second question is, this is from David Taylor. In response to the challenges of COVID-19, what would be the best policy or policies the Biden administration could implement to best help K-20 education? So those are both of the questions. I'll let you answer one or whichever one you want. We've got about close to 10 minutes, so I want to make sure that we keep that in mind. So I'll let you take the questions from here.
Try to be quick on those. For Ethiopia, I check out Imagine Worldwide also. It's a resource, it's a nonprofit organization that is helping to create autonomous learning solutions where schools may not be open in emerging markets and leverage community members in novel ways. So I would check that out. In terms of the Biden administration, I'd love to see as they sort of puzzle their way through how to do accountability and so forth in this, how can they create room for more individual growth in states' plans as they think about assessment systems in the future, so that we're not looking at point in time, but really growth of each individual child.
Okay. Who else? Either one or both questions. All right. Oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
I'll just say that the Biden administration has really indicated that they're trying to unify the country and trying to heal sort of the rifts after a really toxic political time, and that they're showing a lot of empathy. And I think people need empathy so that their mental health can start to build back. And I think that children really need their mental health to come back. The other thing is that the Biden administration is talking about the importance of science and facts. And I think that children who are learning need to learn the importance of science and facts, and that we have to depoliticize what is real and what is not real, so that we can advance learning in a way that will make our society and our world a better place. So sometimes people say, well, we need to spend money on masks or screens or, you know, doing this, that, and the other. You're just going to write a checkbook. I think a lot of it is about using the power of the presidency to advance unifying our country, understanding that education matters, encouraging people to continue their learning, even if it's at their own pace, online, watching a TED Talk, as opposed to, you know, a traditional, learning environment, and to really appreciate the importance of facts and science, and unifying where we can accept the diversity and skills of the people around us, including those who we completely disagree with on politics, who may have everything to offer in terms of other issues. I think that the power of the presidency as a voice of uniting is really what they can do more than anything else.
So,
And to follow up really quickly with Jennifer, she on her webpage and in other spots has really good polling data that she's used to create a questionnaire for elected officials and those running for office. So when she speaks about this, she's done a great job, particularly as it relates to people with disabilities. Let me go to Jeanne, and then I'll go to you, Tom. Sorry about that.
I think, of course, with federal education, there's only so much that they can control on their level, because so much of education is controlled on the state and local level. But I think one thing that the Biden administration can do, and this may be a little controversial, is appoint a strong unifying Secretary of Education that will work on good oversight on the federal level of making sure that special education protections are there, civil rights protections are there for our students, to make sure that that confidence is restored by educators in our federal Department of Education. So I think that will go a long way.
And what Jeanne mentioned is absolutely correct on several fronts. On the funding side, approximately 10% of all funding that's going to our schools comes from the federal government. The bulk of it is state and local in at least 30 states. That's the #1 line item in a governor's budget. And so she's right. Professional development, Title II is used to help your folks. And if you're doing some lightweight lobbying for yourself as a possible candidate for Secretary of Education, glad to hear that as well. Tom.
yeah, there's a question in the chat directed to Michael Horn, so I'd like to share it with him.
Okay.
And it says here, Michael Horn said something like, quote unquote, really good interactions between human beings are the essential aspects of education. We neuroscientists are increasingly aware that much of our learning is based on social engagement. I think someone else said that here as well, particularly with persons we respect and whom we believe care about us. Why is this not emphasized more by educators? It seems so fundamental. And I just quickly like to jump in and respond. Michael, you may want to add something here, but for me, this is one of the things from equity, diversity, and inclusion standpoint that we're really looking at. And the beauty of online learning, it allows you to recruit without boundaries. I feel for traditional schools, particularly universities and colleges that have fixed budgets, and typically their full-time faculty consume the bulk of the personnel line item, and it gives them very little flexibility to hire, particularly adjuncts, to diversify their core faculty. And so know that I think everyone agrees with Michael and your point, but there are fixed costs associated with operating a university that is less restrictive in an online environment.
Sure. Tom, thanks for raising that question. Mike, any response or?
I mean, I think it's a good point. And I think sort of the tragedy of or limitations of our COVID response has been thinking that doing the same, it's what Tom said earlier, frankly, that just thinking that the pedagogy or andragogy, right, of a whole class lecture and just moving that to Zoom would somehow suffice is been crazy to me. And instead, how to use technology to make the interactions between humans more valuable and more robust should be central to our thinking about as we use technology.
Jeanne, I saw your hand up. Yeah.
And one of the things I always open with as an educator is you can't teach them until you reach them. If you don't build those relationships, it just doesn't make a difference. But there are two aspects to teaching. There is the art and the science. And so the science is easy to teach. It's the content, it's the pedagogy, it's the procedures, the policies, and that's easy to measure as well. The art of it, the building rapport, the getting to know your kids is not so easy to measure. So I think for some people who get into it, they get very confident with the content, but they aren't really great they're great with the science of teaching, but they're not so great with the art of teaching. And that is something that really great educators excel at the art part of it, as well as having the science behind them. So that's something, how do you measure the art of education? That is a tricky aspect that we're still working on.
Thank you. Well, all great things must come to an end. We've actually reached the end of our conversation. Mike from CAPE, I want to thank you for sharing what's taking place in the K-12 sector with our private schools, for sharing with us some of the opportunities, some of the wins, but also some of the challenges. Keep up the great work that you're doing, and congratulations to some of your families who've been able to do some tough things in tough times. Jennifer, thank you so much for keeping those adults and children with disabilities on the forefront. Your story about SNAP is so important because we tend to forget about things like that. And thank you also for the work you're doing with those who are in college who have disabilities. And she has a really good workbook put together by someone on her staff as well as a fellow on how to teach students with special education, special needs during COVID-19. You can find it on our website. Michael Horn, I want to thank you for the continued work and innovation. Thanks for giving our friend in Ethiopia a resource to think about, and because what you do is domestic as well as international. And thanks for keeping us hungry for innovation. Sometimes it's not comfortable, but we're not in comfortable times. Thank you, Jeanne, for the work that you're doing in education. I also want to say congratulations to you and to not only your students, but to the K-12 teachers in the public school sector, those who are in person, those who are teaching online. I think some of your teachers get an unfair shake because they didn't want to go into teaching. Somehow we say they weren't interested in the kids. We know that's not the case. I want to thank them for the hard work that they're doing. The bulk of the kids in our country will be in public schools for the foreseeable future. We've got to make sure that that works. And for those, since we've talked about Byte, who are looking for good people for advice on K-12, she's got some good advice she can provide you. She's a part of a network that we have here at the foundation, where we're working with former and existing winners of the State Teacher of the Year Award and National Teacher of the Year Award. And we actually have a link where we have Jeanne and others providing advice. Tom, I want to thank you for your work in K-12 and higher education and talking about the handoff. We've been successful at times with the handoff. We've been unsuccessful with times. Thank you for talking about the diversity of options, both in public and higher ed, and continue to do the great work also as a commissioner of WASC. You've seen some schools close. You've seen some schools do some interesting things. For those of you who are watching live, for those of you who will watch once this is over, for those of you who are listening live, and those of you who will listen later, thank you so much for taking time to be a part of a conversation of looking at K-20 education in a year in review. And as we go into the new year, be on the lookout for the National Survey for Moral Formation. It's a survey where we had collected data from 3,000 teens and 3,000 parents about education from 10 different education sectors. We'll have this available for the public in January, and it will continue to fuel the conversation I've had in my 4 series so far. Again, my name is Gerard Robinson, Vice President for Education at the Advanced Studies and Culture Foundation located in beautiful Charlottesville, Virginia. Thank you for joining us for another series for the Center on Education, Leadership, and Culture. Take care.
Thank you, Gerard.
Thank you so much.
Stay safe.
Great to be with you all today.
All
Happy
right.
holidays.
Thank you.